The gunshot that rang out across Main Street on Christmas Eve morning wasn't meant for Beatrice Sullivan, but it changed her life forever anyway. She stood frozen on the wooden sidewalk, her worn calico dress whipping in the bitter December wind that swept through Presidio, Texas, as men shouted and scattered around her. The bullet had shattered the window of Henderson's general store just 3 feet from where she'd been standing, and now glass littered the ground like ice crystals catching the pale winter sunlight. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself against the storefront, clutching the small package of flour she'd been about to purchase. Everyone inside. Now, Sheriff Morrison's voice boomed across the chaos as 2 more shots fired from somewhere down by the saloon. Beatrice didn't need to be told twice. She ducked through the doorway of Henderson's, joining half a dozen other terrified townspeople who'd taken shelter there. "Damn drifters," old Mr. Henderson muttered, peering cautiously through what remained of his front window. "Third time this month someone's caused trouble. This town's going straight to hell." Beatrice barely heard him. Her mind was already racing ahead to the real disaster waiting for her back at the ranch. The one that had nothing to do with stray bullets and everything to do with the piece of paper, currently burning a hole in her apron pocket. She touched it reflexively, feeling the crisp edges of the foreclosure notice that had been delivered just that morning by Marcus Thornwell's courier. Marcus Thornwell. Even thinking his name made her stomach turn. The banker had been circling her property like a vulture ever since her father had died 6 months ago, waiting for her to miss a payment, waiting for his chance to seize the land that had been in the Sullivan family for 20 years. And now, on Christmas Eve of all days, he'd finally gotten his opportunity. The shooting stopped as abruptly as it had started. Through the broken window, Beatrice watched as Sheriff Morrison and his deputy dragged 2 men out of the Lucky Star saloon, their hands bound behind their backs. The street slowly came back to life as people emerged from their hiding spots, brushing off dust and muttering about the lawlessness that seemed to plague Presidio more with each passing year. "You all right, Miss Sullivan?" Mr. Henderson asked, his weathered face creased with concern. "I'm fine," Beatrice lied, forcing a smile. "Just startled is all. How much do I owe you for the flour?" "Ah, don't worry about it today. Consider it a Christmas gift." The old man's eyes were kind, but Beatrice caught the pity in them and it stung worse than the winter wind. Everyone in town knew about her father's death, about the mortgage, about how she'd been struggling to keep the ranch running on her own. She was 22 years old and failing at the only life she'd ever known. "I insist on paying," she said firmly, counting out coins from her nearly empty purse. Pride was sometimes all she had left, and she'd be damned if she'd let that go too. Henderson accepted the money with a resigned nod, and Beatrice stepped back out into the cold December morning. The sun was climbing higher now, promising a relatively warm day despite it being winter. That was one thing about West Texas. The weather could never quite make up its mind. She hurried toward where she'd tied her father's old mare, grateful the animal hadn't spooked during the shooting. "Miss Sullivan, Miss Beatrice Sullivan." The sound of her name being called made her pause with one foot in the stirrup. She turned to see a young clerk from the First Bank of Presidio rushing toward her, his face flushed and his breath coming in short gasps. "Yes?" she asked, though she already knew nothing good could come from this interaction. "Mr. Thornwell requests your presence at the bank immediately," the clerk said, still gasping. "He says it's urgent business regarding your property." "I received his notice this morning," Beatrice said coldly. "I'm well aware of the situation." "Yes, madam, but he says you need to come now. He's planning to take possession of the ranch before sundown unless you can settle your account in full." The clerk looked uncomfortable, as if he knew how cruel the message sounded. "I'm sorry, madam. I'm just delivering the message." Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. Before sundown, that gave her less than 8 hours to come up with $300, an impossible sum. She'd been hoping to plead for an extension, to promise she'd have the money after the spring cattle sale, but if Thornwell was planning to seize the property today, her plans meant nothing. "Tell Mr. Thornwell I'll be there within the hour," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The clerk nodded and hurried back toward the bank. Beatrice stood there for a long moment, staring at nothing, trying to think of a solution that didn't exist. $300. She didn't have 300 cents, let alone dollars. The ranch had barely produced enough to feed herself and her 2 hired hands this year, and the cattle wouldn't be ready for market until spring. She could sell the cattle now, she supposed, but she'd get a fraction of their value, and without the herd, she'd have no way to make money next year anyway. It would be delaying the inevitable at best. The land itself was valuable, which was exactly why Thornwell wanted it. The Sullivan Ranch had water rights to a stretch of the Rio Grande that most properties in the area couldn't claim, making it prime real estate for ranching or farming. Her father had always said those water rights were worth their weight in gold. Mounting her horse, Beatrice turned toward the bank instead of home. There was no point in putting off the inevitable. She'd go, she'd make her case, and when Thornwell inevitably refused to show mercy, she'd figure out what came next. Maybe she could find work in town, save up enough to rent a small room somewhere. The thought of leaving the ranch, of abandoning the land her father had loved so dearly, made her throat tight with unshed tears. The First Bank of Presidio occupied a prominent corner on Main Street, its brick facade a stark contrast to the wooden buildings that surrounded it. It was the most substantial structure in town aside from the church, a monument to Marcus Thornwell's wealth and influence. Beatrice had always hated this building, had always felt small and insignificant when she walked through its doors. Today was no different. A bell chimed as she entered, and she found herself in the familiar lobby with its polished floors and stern-faced tellers behind iron bars. Everything about this place was designed to intimidate, to remind people that the bank held power over their lives and futures. "Miss Sullivan," one of the tellers said, his tone professionally neutral. "Mr. Thornwell is expecting you. Please go right in." Beatrice walked toward the heavy oak door that led to Thornwell's private office, each step feeling like a march toward execution. She knocked once, heard his smooth voice telling her to enter, and pushed open the door. Marcus Thornwell sat behind an enormous mahogany desk, every inch the successful businessman in his expensive suit and perfectly groomed mustache. He was perhaps 40 years old, handsome in a cold sort of way, and utterly ruthless when it came to business. He smiled when he saw her, but there was no warmth in it. "Miss Sullivan, thank you for coming so promptly. Please have a seat." Beatrice remained standing. "I'd prefer to stand, Mr. Thornwell. I don't intend to be here long. Suit yourself." He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "I assume you received my notice this morning." "I did. And I assume you know I don't have $300 to give you." "Yes, I rather suspected that would be the case." He didn't sound sympathetic. "Which brings us to the purpose of this meeting. I'm prepared to offer you an alternative arrangement." Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "What kind of arrangement? Marry me, and I'll forgive the debt entirely. The ranch will remain in your name, and you'll have the security and protection of being Mrs. Marcus Thornwell. It's a generous offer, Miss Sullivan, far more generous than most men would make." For a moment, Beatrice could only stare at him, certain she'd misheard, but the expectant look on his face told her she hadn't. He was serious. He actually thought she would marry him to save her property. "No," she said flatly. Thornwell's expression hardened. "I'd advise you to think carefully before refusing. Your options are quite limited." "My options don't include marrying a man I don't love for the sake of money. I'd rather lose everything." "Then you're a fool." He stood, his movements precise and controlled. "I'll have the sheriff escort you from the property by sundown. You may take your personal belongings, but the livestock, equipment, and structures all belong to the bank now. Good day, Miss Sullivan." Beatrice felt her world crumbling, but she refused to let him see her break. She lifted her chin and met his eyes squarely. "My father always said you were a snake, Mr. Thornwell. I should have listened to him more carefully." She turned and walked out before he could respond, keeping her spine straight and her head high until she was back outside in the cold December air. Only then did she let herself lean against the building's brick wall, gasping for breath like she'd been running. This was really happening. She was losing everything on Christmas Eve, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it. "You look like you could use a drink." The voice startled her, and she looked up to find a man standing a few feet away, watching her with concern in his dark eyes. He was tall, probably in his mid-20s, with the weathered complexion of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. He wore the practical clothing of a working cowboy, dusty boots, worn denim, a leather vest over a simple cotton shirt, and a hat that had seen better days. But there was something about him that caught her attention, a quiet strength in the way he carried himself, a gentleness in his expression that seemed at odds with the roughness of his appearance. "I don't drink," Beatrice said, wiping at her eyes quickly. "And I don't accept offers from strangers." "Fair enough on both counts." He tipped his hat slightly. "Name's Jackson Ashford, though most folks call me Jack. I work for the Triple R ranch up north. Been in town picking up supplies when all that shooting started earlier." "Beatrice Sullivan," she said automatically, then wondered why she was bothering with introductions when her life was falling apart. "I know who you are," Jack said quietly. "Your father hired me for a cattle drive 2 years back. Good man, fair boss. I was real sorry to hear about his passing." Beatrice remembered that drive now, though she'd only met the hired hands briefly. Her father had spoken well of them all, had said they were skilled and honest workers. "Thank you," she managed. Jack hesitated, then said, "I couldn't help but overhear some of what that bank clerk was saying earlier, about foreclosure. That's a hard thing, especially on Christmas Eve." "It's none of your concern," Beatrice said, more sharply than she intended. The last thing she needed was pity from a stranger, no matter how kind his eyes were. "You're right, it's not," Jack agreed. "But that doesn't mean I don't care. Nobody deserves to lose their home on Christmas." Something about the way he said it, without judgment or condescension, made Beatrice's carefully maintained composure finally crack. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them, and she turned away, mortified to be breaking down on Main Street where anyone could see. "Hey now," Jack said gently, and she felt his hand, light and careful, on her shoulder. "It's all right. Let's get you somewhere more private, yeah. There's a bench behind the general store where folks won't bother you." Beatrice wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain her pride and independence, but she was so tired of being strong all the time. So she let this stranger, this cowboy who'd worked for her father once, guide her around the corner to a quiet spot where she could cry without an audience. She sat on the bench, and Jack sat beside her, not too close, giving her space while still offering his presence as comfort. He didn't try to tell her everything would be fine or offer empty platitudes. He just sat there, solid and steady, while she cried out months of grief and fear and frustration. When the tears finally subsided, Beatrice felt emptied out but somehow lighter. She accepted the handkerchief Jack offered and wiped her face, embarrassed but also strangely grateful. "I'm sorry," she said hoarsely. "I don't usually fall apart like that. Nothing to apologize for. You've been carrying a heavy load by yourself. Sometimes it gets too much." "How would you know what I've been carrying?" Beatrice asked, not unkindly. Jack was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "I lost my own folks when I was 19. Ranch fire took our home and both my parents with it. I know what it feels like to watch everything you love slip through your fingers and not be able to stop it." "I'm sorry," Beatrice said softly, and meant it. "What did you do?" "Sold what was left and hit the trail. Been working as a hired hand ever since, saving what I can, trying to build up enough to start over someday." He looked at her then, and something in his expression made her heart skip. "But at least I had a choice in how I lost it. Fire's one thing. Having someone take it from you deliberately is another." "Marcus Thornwell doesn't care about that distinction," Beatrice said bitterly. "He just wants the land. He even had the audacity to propose marriage as a solution, as if I'd sell myself to keep my property." Jack's jaw tightened. "He what?" "You heard me. Marry him and the debt goes away, as if that's any different from losing everything anyway. That's not marriage, that's extortion." Jack stood abruptly and paced a few steps away, his hands clenched into fists. "Men like Thornwell make me sick. They hide behind laws and contracts and pretend they're respectable, but they're no better than the thieves and outlaws they claim to despise." Beatrice watched him, surprised by the intensity of his reaction. "You don't even know me. Why do you care so much?" Jack turned back to her, and the raw honesty in his face took her breath away. "Because I remember watching your father talk about his ranch and his daughter. He was so proud of you, Miss Sullivan. Said you could ride better than any of his hands, that you had a head for numbers and a heart for the land. He worried about leaving you alone, about whether you'd be all right without him. And I just hate seeing his fears come true when it's not your fault at all." Something warm unfurled in Beatrice's chest, pushing back against the cold despair that had taken root there. "He said all that, he did. Talked about you most nights around the campfire. Some of the other hands used to tease him about it, but I always liked hearing it. Reminded me of how my own father used to talk about my mother." Jack smiled slightly, the expression transforming his whole face. "Anyway, point is, you're not alone in this. Not entirely. That's kind of you to say, but unless you have $300 hidden in your saddlebags, kind words won't stop Thornwell from taking my ranch." The moment the words left her mouth, something shifted in Jack's expression. He went very still, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her nervous. $300, he repeated carefully. "That's the full amount owed." "Yes, but it might as well be 3,000. I don't have it, and I don't have any way to get it by sundown." Jack was quiet for a long moment, and Beatrice could almost see the thoughts racing behind his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and determined. "What if I paid it?" Beatrice laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Mr. Ashford, I appreciate your sympathy, but I'm not interested in charity. Even if you had that kind of money, which I doubt any cowboy does, I couldn't accept it." "It wouldn't be charity," Jack said quickly. "It would be an investment in the ranch in the future. I'd pay the mortgage, and in return I'd work the ranch with you. We could make it profitable again together." "Why would you do that?" Beatrice asked, bewildered. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Jack ran a hand through his hair, looking almost embarrassed. "I've been saving for 6 years, Miss Sullivan. Every dollar I could spare from my wages has gone into a bank account up in Dallas. I've got just over $400 saved up. It was supposed to be the seed money for my own place someday, but the thing is, I don't have land and you don't have money. Seems like we could help each other." Beatrice stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. You'd give up your savings, everything you've worked for, to save my ranch. That makes no sense." "It makes perfect sense to me," Jack said. "I'm 26 years old and tired of drifting. I want a place to call home, land to work, a future to build. Your ranch could be that. And maybe if things worked out, it could be your future too, our future." The way he said that last part, soft and hopeful, made Beatrice's pulse race. "Mr. Ashford, we just met. You can't seriously be suggesting what I think you're suggesting." "I'm suggesting a partnership," Jack said carefully. "Nothing improper, nothing you're not comfortable with. But yes, I'm also saying that if things developed into something more over time, I wouldn't object. Your father talked about you so much that I feel like I already know you a little. And what I've seen today, your strength, your pride, your determination not to compromise your principles even when it costs you everything, well, those are qualities I admire." Beatrice stood, her mind reeling. This was insane. She'd known this man for all of 15 minutes, and he was offering to save her life with money he'd spent 6 years accumulating. It was too much, too fast, too overwhelming. "I can't let you do this," she said firmly. "What if the ranch fails anyway? What if we can't make it profitable? You'd lose everything." "Then I'd be no worse off than I was before I started saving," Jack pointed out. "Except I'd have tried and I'd have helped someone who needed it. That seems worthwhile to me. But why me? Why this?" Jack looked at her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "Honestly, I don't have a good answer to that. All I know is that when I saw you crying on that street corner, something in me said this was important, that you were important. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'll regret it. But I've learned to trust my instincts, and right now, they're telling me to help you." Beatrice wanted to argue, wanted to refuse on principle, but the truth was she had no other options. It was this or lose everything. And there was something about Jackson Ashford that made her want to trust him, despite the insanity of the situation. "If I agreed to this," she said slowly, "it would be a business arrangement. You'd be a partner in the ranch with equal say in how it's run. I won't be beholden to you the way I would have been to Thornwell." "That's fair," Jack agreed immediately. "Equal partners. We make decisions together. And if things don't work out, if we can't get along or the ranch fails despite our efforts, we split whatever's left 50-50. Agreed." "And the other thing you mentioned about the future, about something more." Beatrice felt her cheeks heating but forced herself to continue. "That only happens if both of us want it. I won't be pressured or obligated." "I wouldn't want it any other way," Jack said softly. "I want a partner, not a servant or a possession. Someone who chooses to be with me because she wants to, not because she has to." Beatrice took a deep breath, feeling like she was about to jump off a cliff. "All right then. Let's go talk to Mr. Thornwell." The walk back to the bank felt surreal, like something from a dream. Jack walked beside her, his presence somehow steadying despite the chaos in her thoughts. When they entered the bank, the same teller from before looked up in surprise. "Mr. Thornwell isn't seeing anyone else today," he started to say, but Jack cut him off. "He'll see us," Jack said firmly. "Tell him Miss Sullivan has come to settle her account in full." The teller's eyes widened, and he scurried off toward Thornwell's office. A moment later, the banker emerged, his expression somewhere between annoyed and curious. "Miss Sullivan, I thought I made myself clear," he began, but stopped when he saw Jack. "And who is this?" "This is Jackson Ashford," Beatrice said, finding strength in Jack's presence beside her. "He's here to settle my debt." Thornwell's face went through several interesting changes before settling on cold displeasure. "I see. And what exactly is Mr. Ashford to you, Miss Sullivan?" "That's none of your business," Jack said before Beatrice could answer. "All you need to know is that I have $300 in cash to pay off her mortgage. Unless there's some reason you'd refuse payment." "Of course not," Thornwell said tightly. "Though I must say, this is highly irregular." "No more irregular than proposing marriage to collect a debt," Beatrice said sweetly, enjoying the way Thornwell's face flushed. Jack's head whipped toward her, his expression darkening. "He did what?" "It's handled," Beatrice said quickly, putting a hand on his arm. The muscle beneath her fingers was tense as iron. "Let's just finish this." It took another 20 minutes for the paperwork to be completed. Jack had to send a telegram to his bank in Dallas to arrange the transfer of funds, which meant they'd have to wait for a response. Thornwell seemed almost disappointed that everything was proceeding legally and properly, as if he'd been hoping for some excuse to refuse the payment. They waited in tense silence, Thornwell behind his desk, Beatrice and Jack standing near the door. Finally, the telegram response came through, confirming the funds were available and authorizing their transfer. Jack counted out $300 in crisp bills, money that represented 6 years of hard work and careful saving, and placed it on Thornwell's desk. The banker counted it twice, his movements stiff and resentful. Finally, he pulled out the mortgage documents and stamped them with red ink. "Paid in full." The words had never looked more beautiful to Beatrice. "The property is yours, Miss Sullivan," Thornwell said coldly. "I trust you'll have no further need of the bank's services." "I sincerely hope not," Beatrice replied. She took the documents, clutching them to her chest like a lifeline. Outside, the winter sun was starting to sink lower in the sky, painting everything in shades of gold and pink. Christmas Eve was passing, but instead of losing everything, Beatrice had somehow gained a partner and kept her home. It didn't feel quite real yet. "Thank you," she said to Jack, the words inadequate for what he'd just done. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You don't have to repay me," Jack said. "We're partners now, remember. What's mine is yours and what's yours is mine. That's how this works. I should at least show you the ranch, let you see what you just bought into." Jack grinned, the expression lighting up his whole face. "I'd like that." "Should we head out there now?" They collected Jack's horse from the livery, a handsome buckskin gelding named Chief, and rode out together toward the Sullivan Ranch. It was about 5 miles outside of town, nestled in a valley where the land sloped down toward the Rio Grande. As they crested the final hill and the ranch came into view, Beatrice tried to see it through Jack's eyes. The house was modest but sturdy, built from adobe and wood, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Her father had built it himself when he'd first claimed the land, and over the years, he'd added on rooms and improvements until it was a proper home. Behind the house stood the barn, the bunkhouse where the hands stayed, several corrals and various outbuildings. The land itself stretched for acres in every direction, brown and dormant now in winter but rich with potential. "It's beautiful," Jack said quietly, and the reverence in his voice told Beatrice he meant it. "It could be," Beatrice said. "Right now it's barely hanging on. The herd is small, only about 50 head. We need twice that to turn a decent profit. The equipment is old and needs repairs. The house is solid but drafty in winter. There's a lot of work to be done." "Good," Jack said, surprising her. "I like work, gives me purpose." They rode down to the house, where Beatrice's 2 hired hands, old Pete and his nephew Miguel, emerged from the barn to see who was arriving. Both men looked surprised to see Beatrice with a stranger. "Pete, Miguel, this is Jack Ashford," Beatrice said, dismounting. "He's going to be working the ranch with me as a partner." Pete, who'd known Beatrice since she was a little girl, looked skeptical. "Partner? What happened with the bank?" "The debt is paid," Beatrice said, and watched relief wash over both men's faces. "We're not losing the ranch." "Thank the Lord," Miguel said, crossing himself. "We've been praying all day, Miss Beatrice. This is a Christmas miracle. If they thought it was strange that a cowboy they'd never met had suddenly appeared and saved the ranch, neither man said so. They helped Jack settle his horse in the barn and showed him around the property while Beatrice went inside to start preparing supper. The house felt different as she moved through it, more hopeful somehow. She'd been so certain this morning that she'd be spending her last night here, and now she was planning meals for tomorrow and the day after. It was dizzying, the speed with which her life had changed. She was peeling potatoes when Jack knocked on the door frame, having removed his hat respectfully. "Pete said I should sleep in the bunkhouse with him and Miguel, but I wanted to check with you first. Make sure you're comfortable with the arrangement." "Of course," Beatrice said. "That's where the hands always stay." "I'm not exactly just a hand though, am I?" Jack pointed out. "I'm a partner. But I don't want you to feel like I'm overstepping or making you uncomfortable in your own home." Beatrice set down her knife and turned to face him fully. "Mr. Ashford, Jack, you just spent your life savings to save my ranch. The least I can do is offer you a place to sleep. The bunkhouse is fine for now, but we'll figure out better arrangements as we go." "Fair enough." He hesitated, then said, "What about Pete and Miguel? Can we afford to keep them on?" Beatrice had been worrying about that very question. "Barely. They're good men and hard workers, but payroll is tight. We might have to let Miguel go come spring if things don't improve." "What if we didn't?" Jack said thoughtfully. "I've got about $100 left after paying the mortgage. We could use some of that to buy more cattle, build up the herd faster. It's a risk, but it could pay off. Or we could lose everything if something goes wrong," Beatrice countered. "Disease, drought, rustlers, there are 100 things that could destroy a herd." "There are," Jack agreed. "But there are also 100 things that could go right. We could get good weather, strong calves, good prices at market. We can't be afraid to take chances, Beatrice. Sometimes you have to bet on yourself." Hearing him use her first name sent a little thrill through her, though she tried not to show it. "You're not risk-averse, are you? Not when the potential reward is worth it." The way he looked at her when he said it made it clear he wasn't just talking about cattle. Beatrice felt heat rise in her cheeks and turned back to her potatoes. "We'll discuss it after Christmas. For now, let's just get through the holiday. Speaking of which, do you have a tree, decorations, any of that?" "No," Beatrice admitted. "It seemed foolish to celebrate when I thought I'd be homeless by nightfall." "Well, you're not homeless," Jack said firmly, "and it's Christmas Eve. We should do something to mark the occasion." "It's almost sundown," Beatrice pointed out. "There's no time." "There's always time for Christmas," Jack said with a grin. "Let me handle it. You just focus on that supper I'm smelling." Before Beatrice could argue, he was gone, striding back out toward the barn. She shook her head, bemused by this strange man who dropped into her life like a bolt from above. He was unlike anyone she'd ever met, earnest and genuine in a way that seemed almost old-fashioned. And handsome, she admitted to herself. Very handsome, with those dark eyes and that quick smile. She was still lost in thought when Pete came to the kitchen door. "Miss Beatrice, that new partner of yours is asking if we've got any rope and if I know where there's cedar trees nearby. Should I be worried?" Beatrice laughed, surprising herself with the sound. "No, Pete. I think he's planning something for Christmas. He seems like a good man," Pete said carefully. "But it's mighty sudden, him showing up and paying off the mortgage. You sure you know what you're doing, honestly?" "No," Beatrice admitted. "But I trust him, Pete. I can't explain why, but I do." The old cowboy nodded slowly. "Your daddy always said to trust your gut. If your gut says this Ashford fellow is all right, then I'll trust him too." An hour later, as Beatrice was setting the table for supper, she heard voices and laughter from outside. She stepped onto the porch to find Jack, Pete, and Miguel carrying a small cedar tree toward the house, all three of them grinning like boys up to mischief. "We found one growing down by the creek," Jack explained. "Not too big, but perfect for the house. Where should we put it?" Beatrice directed them to set it up in the corner of the main room, near the fireplace. She hadn't had a Christmas tree since her father died, hadn't wanted to face the holiday alone. But now, watching these three men fuss over the tree, adjusting its position and debating whether it was straight, she felt something warm bloom in her chest. "We don't have decorations," she said, but Jack just waved that away. "We'll make some. Pete, you got any spare wire? Miguel, find me some tin scraps. Miss Beatrice, you got any ribbon or fabric scraps?" For the next hour, they all worked together to create decorations. Jack cut stars from tin cans, their edges carefully folded so no one would cut themselves. Miguel twisted wire into intricate shapes, delicate and beautiful. Beatrice found some old fabric in her mother's sewing basket and cut it into ribbons and bows. Pete contributed pine cones from a bag he'd been saving for kindling. By the time they were done, the little tree was covered in homemade ornaments that caught the firelight and gleamed. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs, and it was beautiful. "Now it feels like Christmas," Jack said softly, standing back to admire their work. They ate supper together, all four of them crowded around the table that usually sat empty except for Beatrice. She'd made beans and cornbread, simple fare but filling, and the men praised it like it was a feast. Afterward, Miguel pulled out a guitar Beatrice hadn't known he owned and played Christmas carols while they sang along. Jack had a good voice, strong and true, and Beatrice found herself harmonizing with him on Silent Night. Their voices blended together naturally, and when the song ended, he smiled at her in a way that made her heart skip. "You sing beautifully," he said. "So do you," she replied, and meant it. As the evening wore on, Pete and Miguel eventually retired to the bunkhouse, leaving Jack and Beatrice alone by the fire. It should have felt awkward, but somehow it didn't. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance and listening to the wind outside. "I still can't quite believe this is real," Beatrice said finally. "This morning I was losing everything. Tonight I have a partner and a future. It doesn't seem possible." "Sometimes the best things in life come when we least expect them," Jack said. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What happened to your father? Pete said he died 6 months ago, but he didn't say how." Beatrice felt the familiar ache in her chest, but it was duller now, less sharp. "His heart gave out. He'd been working on repairing the barn roof when he just collapsed. He was dead before I could get to him." She swallowed hard. "The doctor said it was probably quick, that he didn't suffer. I hope that's true." "I'm sorry," Jack said quietly. "It's a hard thing, losing a parent. Doesn't matter how old you are or how prepared you think you might be, it's still hard. You said your parents died in a fire. Were you there?" Jack nodded, his expression distant. "I was in town picking up supplies. By the time I got back, the house was already engulfed. Neighbors tried to help, but the fire spread too fast. They never made it out." He was silent for a long moment. "For a long time I felt guilty, like if I'd been there maybe I could have saved them." "But you couldn't have," Beatrice said gently. "You would have just died with them." "I know that now. Took me a while to accept it, though." He looked at her then, and in his eyes she saw a reflection of her own pain and loss. "That's part of why I wanted to help you today. I couldn't save my parents or my home, but maybe I could save yours." Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes, but these weren't tears of grief or despair. These were tears of gratitude and something else, something warmer and more complicated. "You did save it, Jack. You saved everything." "We saved it," he corrected gently. "This is a partnership, remember. We're in this together now. Together." The word resonated in Beatrice's heart like a bell. She hadn't been truly together with anyone since her father died, had been carrying the weight of the ranch and her grief entirely alone. The thought of sharing that burden, of having someone to rely on, was almost overwhelming. "I should let you get some rest," Jack said, standing. "It's been a long day for both of us." "Jack, wait." Beatrice stood too, suddenly not wanting him to leave. "I just wanted to say thank you." "Really, thank you. What you did today, what you're doing now, it means more to me than I can express." "You don't have to thank me," Jack said softly. He took a step closer and Beatrice's breath caught. "I wanted to do it. I want to be here." They stood there for a moment, close enough that Beatrice could feel the warmth radiating from him, could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. She wondered what it would be like to close the distance between them, to feel his arms around her, to kiss him. But it was too soon, too fast. They'd only just met, and she didn't want to rush into something she wasn't ready for. Jack seemed to sense her hesitation because he stepped back, giving her space. "Good night, Beatrice. Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, Jack." She watched him walk out into the cold night, heading toward the bunkhouse, and felt a pang of loneliness. But it was different from the loneliness she'd felt before, because now she knew she wasn't truly alone. Tomorrow he'd be back, and they'd start working together to build a future. That night, Beatrice lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling, her mind too full for sleep. She thought about everything that had happened, about the impossible twist of fate that had brought Jack Ashford into her life at exactly the moment she needed him most. She thought about his kind eyes and his quick smile, about the way he'd spent his life savings without hesitation, about how natural it had felt to sit beside him by the fire. She thought about what Pete had said about trusting her gut. And her gut was telling her that Jack was something special, that this strange partnership they'd formed might become something more profound than either of them had anticipated. Outside, a coyote howled at the moon, and somewhere in the darkness, cattle lowed softly. The sounds of the ranch, the sounds of home. Thanks to Jack, she still had this. Thanks to him, she still had a future. And maybe, just maybe, that future would include him not just as a partner, but as something more. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed to stretch forever. Beatrice woke early, as she always did, and dressed quickly in the frigid air. She built up the fire in the kitchen stove and started coffee, then began preparing a proper Christmas breakfast. They had eggs from the chickens, some bacon she'd been saving, and flour for biscuits. It was more than she'd eaten in months, but Christmas deserved celebration. She was just pulling the biscuits from the oven when Jack knocked on the door. He looked freshly washed, his hair damp and his face clean-shaven, and Beatrice felt her heart do a little flip at the sight of him. "Merry Christmas," he said, his smile warm and genuine. "Something smells amazing. Come in, sit down. Pete and Miguel should be here any minute." As if summoned by her words, the other two men appeared, and soon all four of them were seated around the table, passing plates and pouring coffee. It was the most people Beatrice had shared a meal with since her father's funeral, and it felt good. It felt right. "I have something for everyone," Jack announced as they were finishing up. He disappeared outside briefly and returned with a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "I know it's not much, but I wanted to give something to mark the occasion." He handed packages to Pete and Miguel first. Pete unwrapped his to find a new leather belt with a silver buckle, good quality and clearly expensive. Miguel received a pair of riding gloves, equally well made. Both men looked touched by the gifts, thanking Jack profusely. "You didn't have to do that," Pete said gruffly. "You already gave us the gift of keeping our jobs." "I wanted to," Jack said simply. Then he turned to Beatrice and held out a smaller package. "And this is for you." Beatrice took it with trembling fingers, wondering what he could possibly have gotten her. They'd only met yesterday, after all. She unwrapped it carefully and found herself holding a beautiful pocket watch, gold-plated and engraved with delicate flowers. "It was my mother's," Jack explained quietly. "One of the only things that survived the fire. I've been carrying it with me for years, but I think she'd want you to have it. For saving me as much as I saved you." Beatrice looked up at him, stunned. "Jack, I can't take this. It's too precious, too personal." "Please," he said. "I want you to have it. Every time you look at it, you can remember that you're not alone anymore, that you have a partner who cares about you." Beatrice felt tears well up and blinked them back fiercely. The watch was cool and smooth in her palm, surprisingly heavy. She could see the wear on it from years of use, could imagine Jack's mother checking it throughout her days. To be given something so meaningful, something that clearly mattered so much to him, was overwhelming. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll treasure it always." Jack's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "You're welcome." After breakfast, they got to work. Ranch life didn't stop for holidays, and there were animals to feed, water to pump, and repairs that couldn't wait. But there was something festive about the work today, a lightness that had been missing for months. Jack proved himself to be every bit as skilled as Beatrice had hoped. He worked efficiently and thoughtfully, never needing to be told twice how to do something. He seemed to have an instinctive understanding of the land and the animals, moving through tasks with the confidence of someone who'd been ranching all his life. "Where did you learn all this?" Beatrice asked as they worked together to fix a section of fence that had come loose. "My parents' ranch, mostly," Jack said, hammering a nail into place. "And then from every job I've worked since. You pick up something new at every place, different techniques and approaches. I've worked ranches from here to Montana, each one teaching me something valuable." "What made you settle on Presidio?" Jack paused, considering the question. "I liked the feel of it. Not too big, not too small. And the land around here is good, despite the challenges. Plus, I heard the Triple R was looking for hands, and they had a reputation for treating their workers fair." "Do they know you're not coming back?" "I sent a telegram yesterday, letting them know I was staying in town. They won't be happy to lose a hand right before the busy season, but they'll understand." He looked at her sideways. "No regrets if that's what you're worried about." "I wasn't worried," Beatrice lied, and Jack laughed. "Yes, you were, but I meant what I said yesterday, Beatrice. I'm here because I want to be. This ranch, this partnership, it all feels right to me." The way he said "you" made Beatrice's cheeks warm despite the cold air. She busied herself with the fence, trying to hide her reaction, but she could feel Jack watching her with that gentle, knowing smile. They worked through the afternoon, pausing only for a quick lunch. By evening, they'd accomplished more than Beatrice usually managed in 3 days. Having 3 able-bodied men to help made an enormous difference, but it was Jack's presence specifically that changed things. He had a way of organizing work efficiently, of seeing what needed to be done and tackling it without being asked. That night, after another shared meal, Jack asked if he could talk to Beatrice privately. They stepped outside onto the porch, bundling against the cold. "I've been thinking about the ranch," Jack said, leaning against the porch railing. "About what we need to do to make it successful. And we need more cattle, that's a given, but we also need to think about diversification. Maybe some horses for breeding or sheep if the market's good. And we should improve the irrigation from the river, make sure we're maximizing our water rights." Beatrice nodded, impressed by how quickly he'd assessed the situation. "All of that takes money we don't have." "Not necessarily. We could take out a small loan, but from a different bank. One in Del Rio or Eagle Pass, somewhere Thornwell doesn't have influence. Use the land as collateral, but this time we'd be borrowing with a solid plan for repayment." "I just got out of debt," Beatrice said nervously. The thought of going back into it, even strategically, scares me. I understand that, Jack said. But sometimes you have to spend money to make money. We'll be smart about it, conservative. Only borrow what we absolutely need, and only if we're confident we can pay it back. Beatrice thought about it, weighing the risks against the potential rewards. Let me sleep on it, she said finally. It's a big decision, of course. Take all the time you need. We're partners, remember. We decide things together. That word again. Partners. But as Beatrice looked at Jack in the moonlight, saw the care and concern in his eyes, she realized she was starting to think of him as something more. It had only been 2 days, which was ridiculous and far too fast, but there was something about him that called to her. Something that made her want to take chances, to trust, to hope. Jack, she said softly, can I ask you something personal? Anything? Why aren't you married? A man like you, hardworking, kind, decent, someone should have snapped you up years ago. Jack smiled slightly. I've been asked that before. Truth is, I never met anyone I wanted to settle down with. I was always moving, always working, and the women I met either wanted someone with more money or more stability than I could offer. And I didn't want to marry just for the sake of being married. I wanted it to mean something. And now, he looked at her directly, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. Now I've met someone who makes me think about staying put, about building something lasting, about what it might be like to have a real home with a real partner. Beatrice's heart pounded so hard she was sure he could hear it. We barely know each other. I know enough, Jack said softly. I know you're brave and strong and stubborn as hell. I know you cry over your losses, but you don't let them break you. I know you work harder than any 3 men and you care deeply about doing what's right. That's enough for me to know I want to learn everything else. Jack. Beatrice didn't know what to say, how to respond to such raw honesty. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold night air. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, Beatrice. I just want you to know that I'm here and I'm not going anywhere. However long it takes for you to feel the same way I do, I'll wait. And how do you feel? Beatrice whispered, even though she thought she knew the answer. Like I've been waiting my whole life to meet you, Jack said simply. Like saving your ranch was just an excuse to be near you. Like everything I've done and everywhere I've been was leading me to this moment, to this place, to you. Beatrice felt tears sting her eyes, but they were good tears, happy tears. She reached up and touched his cheek, feeling the roughness of day-old stubble against her palm. It's too fast, she said, but even as she said it, she knew she was trying to convince herself more than him. Sometimes the best things happen fast, Jack said, but I'm a patient man. We can take this as slow as you need. Beatrice stood there, her hand against his face, looking into his eyes and seeing nothing but sincerity and affection and hope. And she realized that while her head was saying it was too fast, her heart was saying something entirely different. Her heart was saying this was right, that Jack was right, that sometimes you had to trust the inexplicable pull between 2 people. What if we tried something? She said softly. What if we courted properly while working together? Get to know each other, see if this feeling is real or just the emotion of the moment. I'd like that, Jack said, his smile growing. I'd like that very much. But we take it slow, Beatrice insisted. No rushing into anything, no assumptions. As slow as you want, Jack agreed. Then, with careful deliberation, he took her hand from his face and brought it to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Thank you for giving me a chance, Beatrice. The touch of his lips against her skin sent shivers through her that had nothing to do with the cold. Thank you for believing I was worth saving. They stood there for another moment, hands clasped, before the cold finally drove them inside. But something had shifted between them. Some understanding had been reached. They were partners still, but now they were also something more. Something with potential and promise and possibility. The days after Christmas fell into a pattern. They worked the ranch from dawn to dusk, but the evenings were theirs. Jack would join Beatrice in the house after supper, and they'd sit by the fire and talk. She learned about his childhood on his parents' ranch, about the places he'd traveled and the things he'd seen. He learned about her mother, who died when Beatrice was young, about growing up with just her father, about the dreams she'd had before circumstances had forced her to focus on survival. They discovered they both loved reading, though books were scarce on the frontier. Jack borrowed a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets from Pete and read them aloud to Beatrice in the evenings, his voice giving life to the 400-year-old words. She shared her father's journal with him, letting him read the thoughts and observations of the man who'd built the ranch from nothing. "He would have liked you," Beatrice said one night as Jack carefully turned the fragile pages. "He always respected hard work and honesty." "I hope so," Jack said. "I hope he'd approve of what we're doing here, of our partnership." "I think he'd be relieved," Beatrice admitted. "He worried so much about what would happen to me after he was gone. Knowing I have a true partner now, someone I can rely on, I think it would ease his mind." By the end of January, they'd made significant progress on the ranch. With Jack's remaining money, they'd purchased 10 more head of cattle from a rancher near Del Rio, building up the herd slowly but steadily. They'd repaired the irrigation system, ensuring better water flow from the river. They'd fixed every fence, patched every hole in every roof, and generally brought the property up to a standard it hadn't seen in years. But more importantly, Beatrice and Jack had grown closer. Their conversations had deepened, moving from polite getting-to-know-you questions to real intimacy. They shared their fears and hopes, their regrets and dreams. Beatrice told him about the loneliness of the past 6 months, about nights when she'd cried herself to sleep wondering if she was strong enough to carry on. Jack told her about the guilt he still carried over his parents' deaths, about the nightmares that sometimes woke him in the cold, dark hours before dawn. They learned each other's habits and quirks. Beatrice discovered that Jack hummed while he worked, old songs he'd learned from his mother. Jack learned that Beatrice couldn't function in the morning until she'd had at least 2 cups of coffee. They developed a comfortable rhythm, able to work together without needing many words, each anticipating what the other needed. And slowly, carefully, they began to fall in love. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, though the seed had been planted that first day. Instead, it was a gradual unfolding, a deepening of respect and affection into something warmer and more profound. Beatrice found herself looking for excuses to be near Jack, to hear his laugh or see his smile. Jack started finding little ways to make Beatrice's life easier, fixing things before she asked, bringing her wildflowers he found on his rides, making sure she didn't work herself too hard. The first time Jack kissed her was in early February, on a day when spring seemed close enough to touch despite the calendar. They'd been working on building a new chicken coop, and Beatrice had gotten sawdust in her hair. Jack had reached out to brush it away, his fingers gentle against her temple, and somehow they'd ended up standing very close, looking into each other's eyes. "I'd like to kiss you," Jack had said softly, "if that would be all right." Beatrice had nodded, unable to speak, and then his lips were on hers, warm and soft and perfect. The kiss was sweet and careful, a question more than a demand, and when they pulled apart, Beatrice felt like the world had shifted on its axis. "Oh," she'd breathed, and Jack had smiled. "Oh," he'd agreed. After that, things changed again, subtly but significantly. They still worked together, still talked by the fire, but now there were kisses stolen in the barn, hands held under the table during meals. soft words of affection exchanged in quiet moments. Pete and Miguel noticed, of course, but both men seemed pleased rather than scandalized. They'd grown fond of Jack over the past months and clearly approved of the relationship developing between him and Beatrice. By March, Beatrice knew she was in love. Truly, deeply, completely in love with Jackson Ashford. He'd become the first thing she thought of when she woke and the last thing on her mind before sleep. She loved his strength and his gentleness, his humor and his seriousness, the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Beatrice finally said the words she'd been holding inside. "I love you, Jack." He turned to her, his eyes wide with surprise and joy. "You do?" "I do," she confirmed, feeling lighter for having said it. "I know it's only been a few months, but I'm certain I love you." Jack's smile was incandescent. He pulled her close, kissing her with a passion that took her breath away. When they finally broke apart, he pressed his forehead to hers and whispered, "I love you too, Beatrice. I think I've loved you since the moment I saw you crying on that street corner, trying so hard to be brave." "I'm glad you stopped to talk to me," Beatrice said. "I'm glad you decided to help." "Best decision I ever made," Jack assured her. Then, with a slightly nervous expression, he pulled back and reached into his pocket. "Actually, speaking of decisions, I have something I want to ask you." Beatrice's heart started pounding as she watched him pull out a small box. It was simple wood, worn smooth from handling, and when he opened it, she saw a ring nestled inside. It wasn't fancy, just a plain gold band with a small blue stone, but it was beautiful. "This was my mother's wedding ring," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's the only other thing I saved from the fire besides the watch I gave you. I've been carrying it for 7 years, waiting for the right woman to give it to." He took a deep breath. "Beatrice Sullivan, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Beatrice felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling so wide her cheeks hurt. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, Jack, I'll marry you." Jack let out a whoop of joy that probably scared the cattle, then slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. He kissed her again, longer and deeper this time, and Beatrice felt happiness flood through her like sunlight. They were married in April, just after the spring wildflowers began blooming across the ranch. The ceremony was held in the small church in Presidio, with half the town in attendance. Pete stood up as Jack's best man, and Mrs. Henderson from the general store acted as Beatrice's matron of honor. Even the sheriff came, along with his wife and 3 daughters. The only notable absence was Marcus Thornwell, who'd been conspicuously cold to both Beatrice and Jack whenever they came to town. But his absence didn't bother either of them. This day was about their future, not the past that had nearly destroyed it. Beatrice wore a simple white dress that had belonged to her mother, altered to fit her by Mrs. Henderson's skilled hands. Jack wore a new suit he'd purchased specially for the occasion, looking so handsome that Beatrice could barely breathe when she saw him waiting at the altar. The Reverend kept the ceremony short and sweet, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Jack kissed Beatrice with such tenderness that several women in attendance dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food contributed by nearly everyone in town. There was music and dancing, laughter and toasts. Pete gave a surprisingly eloquent speech about how proud Beatrice's father would have been to see this day. Miguel played his guitar and sang love songs in Spanish that made everyone sigh. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Jack pulled Beatrice aside, away from the crowd. They walked down to the river, to a spot where cottonwood trees provided privacy and the sound of flowing water was peaceful. "Happy?" Jack asked, pulling her close. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Beatrice said honestly. 6 months ago, I was losing everything. Now I have a thriving ranch, a true home, and a husband I love more than words can say. It feels like a dream." "It's not a dream," Jack assured her. "It's real, and it's just the beginning. We're going to build an amazing life together, Beatrice. I promise you that." "We already have," she said, reaching up to kiss him. "This, right here, right now, this is everything I never knew I wanted." They stood there as darkness fell, wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the river and the distant sounds of celebration. It was perfect, a moment suspended in time, the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The first year of their marriage was challenging but rewarding. They worked the ranch together, making decisions jointly and supporting each other through setbacks and celebrating victories. The herd continued to grow, and by the fall cattle drive, they had nearly 100 head to take to market. The sale brought in enough money to not only replenish their savings, but to start making real improvements to the property. They built a new barn, larger and sturdier than the old one. They purchased 2 breeding horses, good stock that would provide colts they could train and sell. They hired 2 more hands to help with the increased workload, young men from town who were eager to learn ranching. But the best news came in December, just before their first Christmas as husband and wife. Beatrice realized she was pregnant. She told Jack on Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after the day they'd met. They were sitting by the fire in the evening, in almost the exact spot where they'd shared so many conversations during their courtship. Beatrice took his hand and placed it on her still, flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she said softly. "You're going to be a father." Jack's face went through a series of expressions: shock, joy, wonder, before settling on pure happiness. "A baby, truly, truly. The doctor confirmed it yesterday when I was in town." Jack pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was made of glass. "This is the best Christmas gift I could ever receive," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you, Beatrice. Thank you for this, for everything, for our life together." "Thank you for saving me," Beatrice said, as she had so many times over the past year, "for believing in me, in us." "We saved each other," Jack corrected, as he always did. "That's what partners do." Their son was born in August of 1888, a healthy baby boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. They named him Thomas, after Beatrice's father, and watching Jack hold his son for the first time was one of the most beautiful moments of Beatrice's life. Fatherhood suited Jack. He was patient and gentle with Thomas, getting up for midnight feedings without complaint, singing lullabies he remembered from his childhood. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, Jack was always there to catch him when he stumbled, to encourage his first steps, to teach him about the ranch and the land. The years passed in a blur of hard work and happiness. The ranch prospered under their joint management, becoming one of the most successful operations in the area. They added sheep to their livestock, as Jack had once suggested, and found a lucrative market for wool. They improved their irrigation system further, making their land some of the most productive in the county. Thomas was joined by a sister when he was 3, a daughter they named Grace, after Jack's mother. Then 2 years later came another son, William. And finally, when Beatrice was 30, their youngest child, a daughter named Rose. The house they'd added onto multiple times to accommodate their growing family. What had been a modest ranch home became a sprawling family residence, full of laughter and noise and life. Pete and Miguel both stayed on through the years, becoming more family than employees, beloved uncles to the children who grew up running wild across the property. Beatrice and Jack's love deepened with each passing year, seasoned by shared experiences and strengthened by weathering difficulties together. They had arguments, of course, disagreements about how to handle various aspects of the ranch or raise the children, but they always worked through them. They'd learned early on that they were stronger together than apart, and that foundation never wavered. On their 10th anniversary, Jack surprised Beatrice with a gift that made her cry. It was a painting, commissioned from an artist in San Antonio, showing the ranch as it was now. The house and barns, the healthy cattle grazing, the river in the background and in the foreground, the two of them standing side by side with their 4 children around them. It was beautiful and perfect, capturing everything they'd built together. "I wanted you to have a reminder," Jack said as she stared at it through tears, "of how far we've come, of everything we've accomplished. From that desperate Christmas Eve to this, it's been an incredible journey." "It has," Beatrice agreed, wrapping her arms around him. "And I wouldn't change a single moment of it. Not even the scary parts, the uncertainty at the beginning, not even that," she said firmly. "Because it led us here to this life, to this love. It was worth it, Jack. Every struggle, every challenge, it was all worth it." As their children grew, Beatrice and Jack made sure to pass on the values that had guided their own lives. They taught Thomas, Grace, William, and Rose about hard work and honesty, about treating people fairly and standing up for what was right. They made sure the children understood the history of the ranch, how close they'd come to losing it, how their father's generosity and courage had saved everything. Thomas, as the oldest, showed a natural aptitude for ranching and often talked about taking over the operation someday. Grace was quieter but had a gift with animals that amazed everyone. William was the scholar of the family, always reading and asking questions about everything. And Rose, the baby, was fearless and adventurous, keeping everyone on their toes with her exploits. Marcus Thornwell, who tried so hard to take the ranch, eventually moved away from Presidio, his banking business struggling after several bad investments. The first bank of Presidio was bought by a larger institution from El Paso, and the new management was far more reasonable and fair. Beatrice and Jack maintained a good relationship with them, occasionally taking out small loans for improvements and always paying them back on time. Pete retired when he turned 70, though he refused to leave the ranch entirely. He moved into a small house they built for him near the main residence, where he could spend his days whittling and telling stories to the children. Miguel eventually married a woman from town and brought her to live in the main bunkhouse, where they raised 3 children of their own who grew up alongside Beatrice and Jack's kids. The ranch became not just a piece of property but a true home, a place where family and love mattered more than profit or prestige. Yes, it was successful financially, but more importantly, it was successful in all the ways that really mattered. It was filled with laughter and joy, with people who cared for each other deeply, with memories being made every single day. On Christmas Eve of 1898, 20 years after the day Jack had paid Beatrice's mortgage and changed both their lives forever, they hosted a huge celebration at the ranch. All 4 children were there, Thomas now 20 and courting a nice girl from town, Grace 17 and helping her mother plan the party, William 15, and excited about starting his studies at a university in the fall, and Rose 13 and making sure everyone knew she was too old to be called the baby anymore. Pete was there, now 80 but still sharp as ever. Miguel and his family, the ranch hands, and half the town of Presidio crowded into the house and spilled out into the yard, despite the winter cold. There was food and music, presents exchanged and stories told. As the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, Beatrice found herself on the porch once again with Jack, just as they'd been that first Christmas Eve. Their children were inside, cleaning up and arguing good-naturedly about who had to do what. The sounds of their family, happy and healthy and whole, drifted out into the night. 20 years, Jack said softly, his arm around Beatrice's waist. Can you believe it? Barely, Beatrice admitted. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you walked up to me outside Thornwell's bank and offered to help. Other times it feels like we've been together forever. Both, Jack decided. It's both. Time is funny that way. He pulled her closer. Any regrets? Not a single one, Beatrice said immediately. You? None. Spending my savings on your mortgage was the best investment I ever made. It bought me a life I never dreamed possible. It was a wedding gift, Beatrice said, as she often did when they talked about that day. You paid my mortgage as a wedding gift before we were even courting, let alone engaged. I had faith, Jack said with a grin. I knew from the first moment that you were someone special, someone worth taking a chance on. Crazy man, Beatrice teased, but she was smiling. Spending your life savings on a woman you just met. Best kind of crazy, Jack replied, then kissed her softly. I love you, Beatrice Ashford. I have loved you for 20 years, and I'll love you for 20 more and 20 after that, for however long we have together. I love you too, Beatrice said, her heart as full as it had been that day she'd said yes to his proposal. Thank you for finding me that Christmas Eve. Thank you for believing in me, in us. Thank you for saying yes, Jack replied. To the partnership, to the courtship, to the marriage, to all of it. Thank you for building this life with me. They stood there in the cold December night, holding each other close, listening to their children's voices inside and feeling the solid presence of the ranch around them. The land that had nearly been lost was now thriving, not just as a business, but as a legacy they would pass on to their children and grandchildren. All because a banker had tried to foreclose on Christmas Eve, and a cowboy had paid the mortgage as a wedding gift to a woman he'd only just met, but somehow knew he was meant to love forever. Inside, the children's laughter rang out and someone started playing the piano, a cheerful Christmas carol that spoke of hope and joy. Jack and Beatrice smiled at each other and went back inside to join their family, to celebrate not just Christmas, but the life they'd built together from nothing but faith and hard work and love. The story that had begun in desperation and fear had become something beautiful, something lasting, something that would endure long after they were gone. It was a story of second chances and unexpected blessings, of strangers becoming partners and partners becoming lovers and lovers becoming family. It was their story, and it was perfect. Years continued to roll by with the steady inevitability of the river that flowed past the ranch. Thomas married his sweetheart, Emily, in 1900 and brought her to live on the property. Jack and Beatrice built them a small house on the eastern edge of the ranch, close enough for family but far enough for privacy. When Thomas and Emily's first child was born the following year, a boy they named Jackson after his grandfather, Beatrice cried happy tears while holding her grandson. Grace found love with a young veterinarian who moved to Presidio from Austin. Daniel was intelligent and kind, and he fit into the family seamlessly. They married in 1903, and while they lived in town so Daniel could maintain his practice, they spent every Sunday at the ranch, bringing their own children to learn about horses and cattle, and the land their mother had grown up loving. William did go off to university, studying literature and history, but he always came home for holidays and summers. He eventually became a teacher in Presidio, passing on his love of learning to a new generation of children. He married late, at 30, to a fellow teacher named Sarah, and their intellectual household was filled with books and lively debates. Rose, true to her adventurous nature, shocked everyone by announcing she wanted to be a doctor. It was almost unheard of for women in their community, but Jack and Beatrice supported her dream wholeheartedly. She went to medical school in the East and eventually returned to practice in Presidio, becoming the first female doctor many people in the area had ever seen. Through it all, Jack and Beatrice remained the heart of the family and the ranch. They aged gracefully together, silver threading through their hair, lines deepening on their faces, but their love never diminishing. If anything, it grew stronger, refined by decades of partnership and mutual respect. They celebrated their 25th anniversary in 1903 with another huge party, surrounded by children and grandchildren and friends. By their 30th in 1908, they had 10 grandchildren, with more on the way. The ranch house was never quiet, always filled with visiting family members and the chaos of multiple generations living and loving together. Pete passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1905 at the age of 87. His funeral was attended by everyone in Presidio, a testament to how beloved he'd been. He was buried on a hill overlooking the ranch, in a spot he'd picked himself years earlier. Jack and Beatrice made sure his grave always had fresh flowers and that his stories were told to every new generation. Miguel lived longer, continuing to work the ranch well into his 70s, though eventually he transitioned to lighter duties. His children and grandchildren all worked the ranch at various times, making them truly part of the extended family. As Jack and Beatrice entered their 50s, they began to step back slightly from the day-to-day operations, letting Thomas take on more of the management responsibilities. It wasn't retirement, not exactly, but a gradual transition that allowed them more time to simply enjoy the fruits of their decades of labor. They took to spending mornings on the porch with coffee, watching the sunrise paint the land in gold and pink. They would ride out together in the afternoons, not to work but simply to appreciate the beauty of the property they'd saved and nurtured. They played with their grandchildren, told stories about the old days, and marveled at how much had changed since that desperate Christmas Eve when their lives had intersected. "You ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't met?" Beatrice asked one morning as they sat watching the sun come up over the horizon. "Sometimes," Jack admitted. "You would have found a way to survive, I'm certain of that. You're too strong and too stubborn to have let Thornwell defeat you permanently." "I'm not so sure," Beatrice said honestly. "I was at the end of my rope that day. If you hadn't appeared when you did, I think I would have lost everything. I might have survived, but I would have been broken. Then I'm grateful every day that I was in Presidio that morning," Jack said, taking her hand. "That I heard the clerk talking, that I had the courage to approach you, that you agreed to let me help." "It was crazy," Beatrice said, shaking her head with a smile. "Absolutely insane. We just met and you were offering to spend your life savings on me." "Best decision I ever made," Jack said, as he always did. "Though I'll admit, if someone had told me that morning that I'd end up married to you with 4 children and a thriving ranch, I might not have believed them. It seemed too good to be true." "But it wasn't," Beatrice said softly. "It was real and it was ours and it was perfect." "Is perfect," Jack corrected. "Still is, will be for as long as we have together." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the world wake up around them. After more than 3 decades together, they'd learned that sometimes words weren't necessary. Sometimes just being together was enough. In 1913, on Christmas Eve, they hosted what would become an annual tradition, a massive family gathering where everyone came home, no matter where they were or what they were doing. All four children, now adults with families of their own, brought their spouses and children. The house overflowed with people. 3 generations of Ashfords and their extended family filling every room with noise and laughter and love. As evening fell, Jack and Beatrice slipped outside for a moment of quiet. It had become their tradition within the larger tradition, a few minutes alone on Christmas Eve to reflect on the past year and look forward to the next. 35 years, Jack said, looking at Beatrice in the lamplight spilling from the windows. At 62, she was still the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, her hair silver now but her eyes as bright and fierce as they'd been that first day. Seems impossible that it's been that long. Seems impossible that it's only been that long, Beatrice countered. I can barely remember what life was like before you. It's like you've always been here. I'm glad of that, Jack said. I want to be part of your earliest memories, your deepest truths. I want to be woven so thoroughly into your life that you can't imagine it without me. You are, Beatrice assured him, reaching up to touch his face. He was 63 now, his hair completely white, his face deeply lined from decades of sun and wind, but to her, he would always be the handsome cowboy who'd stop to help a crying woman on a Presidio street. You're in every breath I take, every beat of my heart. You're the foundation everything else is built on. Jack pulled her close, holding her the way he had on their wedding night, on the births of their children, through every joy and sorrow they'd shared over 35 years. I love you, Beatrice. I will love you until my last breath and beyond, into whatever comes after. I love you too, Beatrice whispered. Thank you for that Christmas Eve. Thank you for saving me. We saved each other, Jack said, as he had countless times before. That's what love does. It saves us from ourselves, from despair, from the belief that we have to face the world alone. Inside, someone called for them to come sing carols. They could hear the children's excited voices, the adults trying to organize everyone, the beautiful chaos of a large family gathering. Ready? Jack asked, offering his arm. Always, Beatrice said, taking it. As long as you're beside me, I'm ready for anything. They walked back inside together, into the warmth and light and love, into the family they'd created and the legacy they were leaving. The ranch that had nearly been lost on a Christmas Eve 35 years ago was now a thriving legacy, a testament to faith and courage and the power of love to transform lives. As Jack and Beatrice stood surrounded by their children and grandchildren, singing Christmas carols by the tree, they knew that the decision made all those years ago, a desperate woman accepting help from a compassionate stranger, had been the beginning of something extraordinary. Not just a marriage or a family, but a love story for the ages, one that would be told and retold by their descendants for generations to come. The story of how a banker tried to foreclose on Christmas Eve, and how a cowboy paid the mortgage as a wedding gift to a woman he was destined to love forever. It was their story, their truth, their life, and it was beautiful beyond measure. The years that followed were gentle to them, blessed with good health and continued prosperity. They celebrated their 40th anniversary in 1918, their 50th in 1928. By then, they had great-grandchildren running around the ranch, a fourth generation learning to love the land their great-grandparents had fought so hard to keep. Jack and Beatrice aged into their 80s, moving more slowly but with spirits still bright. They spent their days together, never far from each other, completing each other's sentences and communicating with looks that needed no words. They had become what all couples hope to become, two individuals who'd merged into a perfect partnership without losing themselves in the process. On a warm spring day in 1935, Jack passed away peacefully in his sleep, Beatrice's hand in his. He was 84 years old and had lived to see his family grow into something magnificent. His last words were simple. "Thank you for the life we built together. I love you." Beatrice grieved, as anyone would after losing their partner of 57 years, but she didn't break. Jack had taught her too well about resilience and hope. She lived for another 4 years, surrounded by her loving family, telling stories about her cowboy who'd saved Christmas and stolen her heart. When Beatrice passed in 1939 at the age of 85, she was buried next to Jack on the hill overlooking the ranch, in the spot they'd chosen together years before. Their graves sat side by side, just as they'd lived their lives, with a shared headstone that read Jackson Ashford and Beatrice Sullivan Ashford, partners in life, love, and legacy forever together. Their children ensured that the ranch remained in the family, passed down through the generations as Jack and Beatrice had always hoped. The story of how they met, how Jack had saved the ranch on Christmas Eve and eventually made Beatrice his bride, became family legend, told and retold at every gathering. And every Christmas Eve, without fail, the family would gather at the ranch house, expanded and modernized over the decades, but still fundamentally the same home Jack and Beatrice had built together. They would sing carols, exchange gifts, share meals, and someone would inevitably tell the story again, of the banker who tried to foreclose and the cowboy who paid the mortgage as a wedding gift. It was a story of courage and compassion, of taking chances on people and believing in the power of love to change lives. It was a story that reminded each new generation that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places, and that one act of kindness can ripple forward through time, affecting lives that haven't even been lived yet. Jack and Beatrice's legacy wasn't just the thriving ranch or the large family they'd created. It was the love they'd shared, pure and true and enduring, a love that had started with a desperate plea and a generous heart, and had grown into something that transcended death itself. Their story, born on that cold Christmas Eve in 1878 in Presidio, Texas, became timeless, a testament to the truth that love, real love, can save us, transform us, and make us believe in miracles. And for anyone who doubted that miracles could happen, they needed only to visit the Ashford Ranch and hear the story of Jack and Beatrice, the cowboy and the woman he saved, who saved him right back, and together built a life that would endure for generations. It was a love story for the ages, and it all began with 3 simple things: a desperate situation, a compassionate heart, and the courage to take a chance on a stranger who would become everything. That was the true gift Jack gave Beatrice that Christmas Eve, not just the money that saved her ranch, but the love that saved her soul and gave her a future beyond anything she dared to dream. And that was how their story ended, and also how it lived on forever, in the land they'd nurtured, the family they'd raised, and the love that could never die as long as someone remembered to tell the tale of the banker who tried to foreclose on Christmas Eve, and the cowboy who paid the mortgage as a wedding gift to the woman who became his wife, his partner, and his forever love.